Welcome to Neuro. We're going to start with a review of anatomy and physiology. The central, peripheral, and autonomic nervous system are all components. The central nervous system includes the brain and spinal cord and contains the majority of axons and synapses. The peripheral nervous system includes the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. Think of it as the voluntary sympathetic nervous system, transmitting information to and from. And the autonomic includes the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Think of it as the involuntary nervous system. Sympathetic, as you remember, fight or flight, and parasympathetic, rest and digest. The neurons are the basic unit of the nervous system. They carry messages to and from the brain and spinal cord. The message is carried from the dendrites to the cell body, to the axon, and away from the cell body. The neuroglial cells provide and support protection for the neuron. They outnumber neurons by 50 to 1. That's impressive. The neuron is responsible for neurotransmission. The axon is covered with fatty sheaths called myelin. This helps increase the speed of conduction. Myelin is formed from the oligodendrocyte, which is a type of glial cells. Cell bodies and dendrites make up the gray matter. Myelinated nerve fibers, which are the axons, make up the white matter of the brain and spinal cord. Well, how are sensory impulses transmitted to the brain? Afferent neurons, which are the ascending pathways to the central nervous system, with receptors in the skin, muscle, and organs. And how are motor impulses transmitted from the brain to the muscles? By the efferent neurons, descending pathways from the central nervous system to cause an action. Neurons band together into peripheral spinal nerves, spinal cord, and tissue of the brain. Well, how does the neuron transmit information? Through action potentials. These are the impulses that allow communication between the neurons and body cells. To generate a nerve impulse, there is a stimulus that creates a change in electrical charge. This is regulated by the sodium and potassium. Now remember, there are chemicals that move the impulses across the synaptic cleft. Refamiliarize yourself with some of these neurotransmitters. Not all inclusive, but review acetylcholine, which is cholinergic, acetylcholinesterase, which breaks down acetylcholine and removes from the synapse, norepinephrine, which is adrenergic, and serotonin and dopamine. The brain. The brain is the body's controlling organ. It's responsible for organizing functions of other body organ systems. Its functions are localized to specific areas. For example, the cerebrum includes all lobe functions. The diencephalon connects the cerebrum to the brainstem, and this includes the thalamus, which sorts and clusters multiple sensory input and stimuli to the cortical cells, and the hypothalamus, which regulates autonomic nervous system function, such as heart rate, blood pressure, water and electrolyte balance, intestinal, stomach mobility, body temperature, hunger, weight, and also regulates the pituitary. Then the brainstem, it's the conduction pathway track crossing for respiratory nuclei from the anterior to the cerebellum and above the spinal cord. It includes the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum, which has to do with balance and coordination. Let's talk about the different lobes of the cerebrum. First, remember the cerebrum is separated into two hemispheres. They are connected by a band of fibers called the corpus callosum. In a condition called acogenesis of the corpus callosum, this connection is absent, and it's going to affect affect and abstract thinking. The frontal lobe is who we are, what we do. It helps us with foresight, planning, judgment, tact, and inhibition. It allows for emotional expression, personality and behavior, and intellect. It helps us with voluntary movement and motor speech, which is also referred to as the Broca's area. In most people, Broca's area is the left lobe. Broca coordinates motor activity of the mouth and tongue. A damage to Broca's area could lead to Broca's aphasia. The patient will need alternative method of communications. When we refer to a patient acting frontal, we're referring to them being impulsive. Now, the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe has to do with somatosensory, sensation from the body surface, including pain, temperature, touch, texture, and proprioception. The temporal lobe has to do with hearing, smell, taste, and memory, and receptive language. This is the Wernicke's area. In most people, it is also in the left lobe. It helps us with comprehension. The limbic system has to do with emotional and sexual arousal, behavior, and recent memory and smell. It includes the basal ganglia. The occipital lobe helps us with vision, perceives and interprets visual stimulus and spatial relationship. Now keep in mind, each hemisphere receives sensory motor impulse from the opposite side of the body. Motor impulses descending from the brain cross in the medulla, so the right controls the left and the left controls the right. The cerebellum coordinates a skeletal muscle activity. It's connected to the brainstem. It maintains equilibrium, balance, and posture, and helps us with control of fine motor skills. Most of the tracts in the cerebellum travel through ipsilateral nuclei, which means that the right hemisphere affects the right side of the body, and the left affects the left. Now let's apply information with the cerebellum. If we have an infarct to the cerebellum area, how are we going to help the patient best? Well, we're going to have to ensure that there is support because it regulates muscle tension needed for balance and posture. Think about how you would apply this. The basal ganglia are thought of as the motor, but they have no direct connections to the spinal cord. They are masses of gray matter deep within the cerebrum. They coordinate and control complex motor activity. They help to initiate and coordinate movement and control automatic associated movements of the body, such as swinging the arms, alternating with the legs as we walk. Also, they produce GABA, norepinephrine, and dopamine. They're functionally important in controlling what? Voluntary movements and establishing postures. Well, how are problems with this area going to present? If it's altered, there's going to be involuntary movements, such as jerking of the arms and legs, a spasmodic movement, slowing movements, such as tremor and difficulty walking, or rigid involuntary movement, increased tone, spasms, tics, muscle freezing. Any of those can present, depending on the dysfunction. Conditions related to problems with this area include Parkinson's, Huntington, Wilson's, and etc. But any of these following conditions can also damage the basal ganglia: a stroke, metabolic, such as with drug overdose, liver disease, multiple sclerosis, and infections. The brainstem. It contains nuclei for cranial nerves 3 to 12. Autonomic or involuntary survival functions, such as breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature, coughing, vomiting, can occur with the brainstem. It is anterior to the cerebellum and above the spinal cord. 3 parts. The midbrain serves as a reflex center for cranial nerves 3 and 4, the auditory and visual reflexes. It also serves as the nerve pathway between cerebral hemispheres and the lower brain. The pons links the brain to the medulla oblongata. It regulates respiration, facial movement and sensation, eye movement. It is also the reflex center for cranial nerves 5 through 8. It mediates chewing, taste, saliva, hearing, and equilibrium. The medulla oblongata joins the spinal cord at the foramen magnum. It influences cardiac rate, blood pressure, respiration, and swallowing. It is the center for vomiting, coughing, hiccup reflexes. If we have an infarct to the brainstem, better believe it, there is going to be changes in respiration, such as bradypnea. The spinal cord connects the brain with the body. It starts at the brainstem until the lumbar 1 and lumbar 2 vertebrae. The spinal cord contains motor and sensory pathways that exit and enter the cord via the anterior and posterior nerve roots and the spinal and peripheral nerves. It serves as the center for reflex action. Remember, if a patient is brain dead, they can still have reflexes. Spinal cord is surrounded and protected by the spinal column. Any damage can cut off the brain from the body structures distal to the injury site. The brain and spinal cord are protected from shock, infection by the skull and the vertebral column. It is enclosed in a protective box, including skin, muscle, bone, and meninges. The meninges are 3 layers of tissue enclosing the brain and spinal cord. It includes the dura mater, which is thick, adhering to the skull, the arachnoid, and the pia. Pia mater is what lines the brain tissue. It's very thin. Do you remember the foramen magnum? This is where the brainstem and the spinal cord join. Also, remember how irregular these edges in the base of the skull are, because you will apply that concept later. Cerebral spinal fluid is a clear, colorless fluid formed by the choroid plexus. There is about 80 to 200 milliliters replaced several times daily. It surrounds the brain and spinal cord in the subarachnoid space. The brain has 4 chambers filled with CSF, and ducts link the ventricles to allow the CSF to circulate. It acts as a shock absorber, cushioning the brain tissue, protects brain and spinal cord from trauma, and jolts and shocks. It provides nourishment and removes waste product. The brain requires about 20% of cardiac output. It receives 3/4 of a liter per minute of blood. But what protects the brain from harmful substances? Well, the blood-brain barrier. It allows lipids, glucose, oxygen, carbon dioxide, amino acids. But it does not allow urea, creatinine, protein, toxins, and some antibiotics, if not all. The brain uses 20% of the body's oxygens. Well, why so much oxygen is needed? Well, for metabolism of glucose. It is, remember, the brain's sole source of energy. The brain is going to have a continual need for glucose for energy, and blood flow is going to be regulated by an increased carbon dioxide level concentration. Remember this from fluid and electrolytes? An increased CO2 concentration is going to lead to vasodilation and increased cerebral blood flow. Autoregulation allows the ability to maintain constant cerebral blood flow despite changes in systemic blood pressure. Remember, cerebral tissues have no oxygen or glucose reserve, and this is an important concept. Let's move on into the peripheral nervous system. Neuron pathways between the central nervous system and outlying structures in the body. This includes the sensory or afferent, which are impulses to the brain and spinal cord, the motor or efferent neurons, which conduct impulse away from the brain and spinal cord. Most nerves, however, remember, are mixed, so they're both sensory and motor. The peripheral nervous system includes 12 pairs of cranial nerves, which govern motor, sensory, and specialized functions like smell, vision, and hearing, and 31 pairs of spinal nerves, which are all mixed. Please review this slide for cranial nerves. There are some mnemonics here to help you remember. Now, cranial nerves can either be sensory, motor, or both, but spinal nerves are all mixed nerves. So the peripheral nerves link the central nervous system to the rest of the body. There is 31 pairs of spinal nerves attaching to the spinal cord, each having an anterior ventral root, which is motor, and a posterior dorsal root, which is sensory. Damage to the posterior spinal roots, such as after a motorcycle accident, can lead to a loss of sensation to fine touch. It would be difficult for the person to distinguish between dull or sharp sensations. Anterior and posterior roots merge to form short spinal nerve, which is less than 5 millimeters, and spinal nerve fibers commingle with similar fibers from other levels to form peripheral nerves. Reflexes are rapid, involuntary, unpredictable motor responses to a stimulus. It can be somatic or autonomic. Autonomic includes activation of the heart, smooth muscles, and glands. Now, the lower motor neurons maintain muscle tone and reflexes. If there's damage, there is going to be loss of reflex. This slide is for your information. Remember, all spinal nerves are mixed nerves that take impulses to and from the spinal cord. And this slide is also a helpful reference for your information. Dermatomes indicate the distribution of the spinal nerves and provide an anatomic landmark that is useful for locating neurological lesions. Let's now talk about the autonomic nervous system. Somatic nervous system operates under the conscious control, and autonomic nervous system functions are involuntary. It is the part of the peripheral nervous system that regulates the internal environment of the body. Keep in mind, neurons have the capacity to detect changes in and control the activity of the viscera. It is a complex system of nerves that regulates the activity of the heart and smooth muscles and glands. It governs involuntary actions, such as visceral, smooth, and cardiac, as well as glandular responses. It is primarily controlled by reticular formation in the brainstem. There is two divisions. Fibers of both affect same structures with opposite effects. So the sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight response, mediates stress. And the parasympathetic nervous system, including acetylcholine, conserves and restores energy. This slide is also for your information. You should be familiar with it.